Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet one in her military unit. At 24, she carried herself with a confidence that came from years of rigorous training, but there was something else about her that made her fellow soldiers take notice. It wasn't her sharpshooting skills or her ability to navigate through the toughest terrain without breaking a sweat. It was the intricate tattoo that covered most of her left shoulder and upper arm. The tattoo was unlike anything anyone had seen before. It depicted a detailed military scene with soldiers in combat gear, but the uniforms were different from any current military branch. The weapons looked advanced, almost futuristic, and there were symbols and numbers woven throughout the design that seemed to tell a story. Most striking of all was a figure in the center who appeared to be giving orders, with a face that looked remarkably familiar to anyone who had studied military history. When Sarah first joined the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, her bunkmates were curious about the unusual artwork. During their first week of training, Private Johnson couldn't help but ask about it during their evening downtime. "That's some serious ink you got there, Martinez," he said, pointing to her exposed shoulder as she changed into her PT gear. "Looks like it took forever to finish. What's the story behind it?" Sarah paused for a moment, looking at the faces around her. Her fellow soldiers had stopped their conversations and were now listening intently. She had known this question would come eventually, but she still felt nervous about sharing the truth. "It's about my grandfather," she said quietly. "He served in a special operations unit during World War II. This tattoo represents his unit and their final mission." The room fell silent for a moment before Sergeant Williams, their squad leader, let out a skeptical laugh. "Come on, Martinez. That gear in your tattoo doesn't look like anything from the 40s. Those weapons, those uniforms, even those communication devices on their helmets. World War II soldiers didn't have that kind of equipment." Sarah's jaw tightened. She had expected this reaction, but it still stung. "I know how it looks, but I'm telling you the truth. My grandfather was part of a classified unit that tested experimental equipment. He told me stories about it before he passed away last year." Private Thompson, who had been examining the tattoo more closely, shook his head. "Sarah, I've studied military history my whole life. My dad was a Marine, my grandfather fought in Korea, and I can tell you that nothing in this tattoo matches any historical record I've ever seen. It looks more like something out of a science fiction movie." The other soldiers began to murmur among themselves. Some exchanged glances that clearly showed they thought Sarah was making up an elaborate story to make her tattoo seem more meaningful than it really was. Others seemed genuinely confused, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew about military history. "Look, I get that you want your tattoo to have meaning," said Corporal Davis, trying to sound diplomatic. "But you don't need to create some fantasy story about secret missions and experimental weapons. It's okay to just say you like the design." Sarah felt her face flush with frustration and embarrassment. "I'm not making anything up. My grandfather's name was Eduardo Martinez, and he served in a unit that was so classified that most of their records are still sealed. The tattoo artist worked directly from photographs and documents that my grandfather kept hidden for over 70 years. "Hidden documents?" Williams raised an eyebrow. "Right. And I suppose these mysterious photos just happen to show soldiers with equipment that wouldn't be invented for decades?" The conversation was attracting attention from other soldiers in the barracks. Soon, Sarah found herself surrounded by nearly 20 people, all staring at her tattoo and listening to what they clearly believed was an increasingly unbelievable story. "My grandfather made me promise to never let the world forget about what his unit accomplished," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger despite the skeptical faces around her. "They were sent on a mission behind enemy lines that changed the course of the war. The experimental gear they carried was so advanced that the military decided to classify everything about it to prevent the technology from falling into the wrong hands." Private Johnson crossed his arms. So you're telling us that your grandfather was basically a time traveler with future weapons, fighting Nazis in 1944? That's not what I said, Sarah replied firmly. I said they were testing experimental equipment. The military was working on things during the war that didn't become public knowledge until decades later. Some of it never became public knowledge at all. The crowd around her was growing larger, and Sarah could hear whispered comments that made her heart sink. Words like attention seeker and made-up story reached her ears. She realized that trying to explain further would only make things worse. Sergeant Williams stepped forward, clearly wanting to end the spectacle. All right, everyone back to your business. Martinez, I don't care if your tattoo is about aliens fighting dinosaurs, as long as you can shoot straight and follow orders. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah sat on her bunk, feeling more alone than she had since joining the military. She looked down at the tattoo that had cost her nearly $3,000 and taken 8 months to complete. Every line, every symbol, every detail had been carefully crafted based on the materials her grandfather had entrusted to her before his death. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory from their last conversation in the hospital. His weathered hands had gripped hers tightly as he whispered, "Promise me, mija, that you'll remember what we did. Promise me you'll find a way to honor the men who never came home from that mission." She had promised, and the tattoo was her way of keeping that promise. But now, surrounded by people who thought she was either delusional or lying, Sarah began to wonder if her grandfather's stories had been real, or if the medications and illness had affected his memories more than she had realized. Over the next several weeks, the story of Sarah's fantasy tattoo spread throughout the base. Soldiers from other units would sometimes approach her during meals or training exercises, asking to see the tattoo that supposedly depicted secret time-traveling soldiers. The attention was mortifying, and Sarah found herself wearing long sleeves whenever possible, even during hot summer days. Her commanding officers began to notice the situation as well. During a routine meeting, Captain Foster pulled her aside to address the issue. "Martinez, I've been hearing some interesting stories about your tattoo," he said, his tone suggesting he was trying to remain neutral. "I want to make sure this isn't affecting your ability to integrate with your unit." Sarah straightened her posture. "No, sir, it's not affecting my performance." "Good. But I also want you to understand that military morale depends on trust and credibility. If your fellow soldiers think you're someone who fabricates stories for attention, that could become a problem." The implication was clear. Sarah's credibility as a soldier was being questioned because of her insistence on the truth behind her tattoo. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she would never lie about something so important to her family's legacy, but she could see that Captain Foster had already made up his mind about the situation. "I understand, sir," she replied quietly. That evening, Sarah sat in the base library, staring at her laptop screen. She had spent hours searching through military databases, historical archives, and declassified documents, looking for any trace of her grandfather's unit or their mission. But every search came up empty. There were no records of Eduardo Martinez serving in any special operations unit, no documentation of experimental weapons programs that matched her grandfather's descriptions, and no evidence of the classified mission he had described to her in such vivid detail. For the first time since getting the tattoo, Sarah began to seriously doubt her grandfather's stories. Maybe the other soldiers were right. Maybe her grandfather's illness had affected his memories, causing him to confuse dreams or movies with actual experiences. Maybe the photographs and documents she thought she remembered seeing were figments of her own imagination, created by her desire to believe in something extraordinary. As she closed her laptop and prepared to return to the barracks, Sarah caught her reflection in the library window. The tattoo was visible beneath her rolled-up sleeve, as detailed and mysterious as ever. Whether the story behind it was real or not, she had made it a permanent part of herself. Now she would have to live with the consequences of that decision, and the growing reputation as the soldier who couldn't tell the difference between reality and fantasy. 3 months passed, and Sarah had learned to live with the whispers and sideways glances from her fellow soldiers. She focused on her training, excelled in every exercise, and tried to ignore the nickname time traveler that some of the troops had started using behind her back. She had almost convinced herself that maybe her grandfather's stories were just the confused memories of an old, sick man when everything changed during a routine visit from high-ranking officials. It was a Tuesday morning when word spread through the base that a group of senior military commanders would be conducting inspections and reviewing various units. Among them was Commander General Robert Hayes, a legendary figure in the military who had served for over 4 decades and was known for his encyclopedic knowledge of military history and classified operations. Sarah was helping her unit prepare their equipment for inspection when she noticed a small group of high-ranking officers approaching their area. She kept her head down and continued working, hoping to avoid any attention that might lead to questions about her tattoo. But as fate would have it, the hot North Carolina sun forced her to roll up her sleeves while lifting heavy equipment. Commander General Hayes was walking past with Captain Foster when something caught his eye. He stopped abruptly, staring at Sarah's exposed arm with an expression that made everyone around them freeze. "Soldier!" he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect for decades. "Come here!" Sarah's heart pounded as she approached the group of officers. She could feel the eyes of her entire unit watching her, probably expecting another embarrassing moment related to her tattoo. "Show me your arm," the Commander General ordered. Sarah reluctantly extended her left arm, revealing the full tattoo that had caused her so much trouble. She braced herself for another round of skepticism or criticism about her fantasy military history. But instead of the dismissive reaction she expected, Commander General Hayes studied the tattoo with intense concentration. His eyes traced every detail, every symbol, every figure depicted in the intricate design. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, while other officers and soldiers watched in confusion. Finally, the Commander General looked up at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What's your name, soldier?" "Private Sarah Martinez, sir." "Martinez?" he repeated slowly, as if testing the name. "Tell me about your grandfather." Sarah felt her mouth go dry. She glanced around at the faces watching her, including Sergeant Williams and the other soldiers who had mocked her story. "Sir, my grandfather was Eduardo Martinez. He said he served in a special operations unit during World War II. The Commander General nodded slowly. "And what did he tell you about his service?" Sarah hesitated. She had been ridiculed so many times for sharing her grandfather's stories that she was reluctant to repeat them in front of such a high-ranking official. "Sir, he told me about a classified mission his unit carried out behind enemy lines. He said they were testing experimental equipment and that their records were sealed." "What kind of experimental equipment?" the Commander General pressed. "Advanced weapons, communication devices, protective gear that was decades ahead of its time," Sarah replied quietly. "He said their mission changed the course of the war, but that the technology they used was so sensitive that everything about it was classified." The other officers were exchanging puzzled glances. Captain Foster stepped forward with a concerned expression. "Sir, Private Martinez has been sharing these stories for months. We've tried to explain to her that there are no historical records supporting her claims about this supposed classified unit." Commander General Hayes raised his hand to silence Captain Foster, never taking his eyes off Sarah. "What else did your grandfather tell you about this mission?" Sarah felt trapped between her desire to honor her grandfather's memory and her fear of further ridicule. But something in the Commander General's intense gaze told her she needed to tell the complete truth. "He said his unit was called Phantom Battalion," she continued. 12 men who were chosen for a mission so secret that officially They never existed. He told me they were inserted behind German lines in 1944 with equipment that wouldn't be revealed to the public for decades. Their mission was to eliminate a high-value target who was developing advanced weapons technology for the Nazis. The Commander General's expression remained unreadable, but Sarah noticed that his posture had changed. He seemed more alert, more focused than before. He said only 3 men from his unit survived the mission, Sarah added. My grandfather, a man named Thomas Chen, and their commanding officer, Captain William Hayes. At the mention of the name Hayes, the Commander General's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. The other officers noticed the reaction but didn't understand its significance. Your grandfather told you about Captain William Hayes? The Commander General asked, his voice carefully controlled. Yes, sir. He said Captain Hayes was the bravest man he ever served under, that he sacrificed himself to ensure the mission's success, and that the other survivors would make it home safely. Sarah could see that something significant was happening, but she didn't understand what. The atmosphere around them had become tense, and she noticed that some of the other soldiers who had been mocking her stories were now looking uncertain and confused. Commander General Hayes was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tattoo with what looked like a mixture of recognition and disbelief. Finally, he spoke again, but his voice was different now, softer and more personal. Private Martinez, what did your grandfather tell you about Captain Hayes's family? He said the captain had a young son back home who would grow up never knowing what his father had really accomplished, Sarah replied. My grandfather always regretted that the captain's family would never know the truth about how he died saving his men. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could see that Commander General Hayes was struggling with some internal conflict, as if he was weighing a decision that could have serious consequences. Sir, is everything all right? Captain Foster asked, clearly confused by the unusual turn the conversation had taken. The Commander General looked around at the assembled group of officers and soldiers, all of whom were watching the exchange with growing bewilderment. Sarah could see him making some kind of calculation, deciding how much he could reveal in front of so many people. Private Martinez, I need to speak with you privately, he said finally. Captain Foster, please arrange for a secure conference room immediately. As they walked toward the building, Sarah could hear the murmur of voices behind her. Her fellow soldiers were clearly trying to process what they had just witnessed. The same people who had been mocking her for months were now looking at her with a mixture of confusion and newfound respect. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself sitting across from Commander General Hayes in a small windowless conference room. The change in his demeanor was remarkable. Gone was the formal, distant military bearing. Instead, he looked like a man who was grappling with a revelation that had shaken him to his core. Private Martinez, he began, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. Most of what I know about Phantom Battalion has never been officially acknowledged by any government agency. Sarah felt her heart racing. Sir, are you saying that my grandfather's stories were true? The Commander General leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Your grandfather, Eduardo Martinez, was indeed a member of a highly classified special operations unit during World War II. Everything he told you about their experimental equipment and their mission behind enemy lines was accurate. Sarah felt dizzy with relief and vindication. But, sir, there are no records. I've searched every database I could access. The records exist, he replied, but they're sealed under a classification level that most people don't even know exists. The technology that Phantom Battalion field tested was so far ahead of its time that revealing it would have caused international incidents and arms races that could have destabilized the entire post-war period. How do you know all this? Sarah asked. Commander General Hayes was quiet for a moment, then reached into his jacket and pulled out an old, faded photograph. He placed it on the table between them. The photograph showed a group of 12 soldiers in uniform, standing in front of what appeared to be experimental military equipment. Sarah's eyes immediately went to the young man in the center of the group, who bore an unmistakable resemblance to her grandfather. But her attention was quickly drawn to the soldier standing next to him. A man with captain's bars who looked remarkably like a younger version of the Commander General sitting across from her. "Captain William Hayes was my father," he said quietly, "and Private Eduardo Martinez was his closest friend and the man who carried my father's final message back to our family." Sarah stared at the photograph in disbelief, her mind racing to process this incredible revelation. The man sitting across from her was the son of the commanding officer her grandfather had spoken about with such reverence and sadness. "Your father," she whispered, looking between the photograph and Commander General Hayes. "My grandfather talked about him constantly. He said Captain Hayes saved their lives." The Commander General nodded, his eyes fixed on the old photograph. "After the war, your grandfather came to see my mother and me. I was only 8 years old, but I remember that day clearly. He was still recovering from injuries he sustained during the mission, but he insisted on making the trip to tell us about my father's final moments." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized the significance of this meeting. "What did he tell you?" "He told us that my father had volunteered for the most dangerous part of the mission, knowing it would likely cost him his life," the Commander General continued. "The target they were after was a German scientist who was developing advanced radar technology that could have changed the outcome of the war. The facility was heavily guarded, and getting to the target meant someone would have to stay behind to hold off the enemy forces while the others escaped with the intelligence they had gathered." Sarah listened intently, remembering the similar stories her grandfather had shared with her during his final days. "Your grandfather said my father looked him in the eye and told him to make sure his family knew he died doing something that mattered," Commander General Hayes said, his voice thick with emotion. "Eduardo Martinez kept that promise. He not only told us about my father's sacrifice, but he stayed in touch with our family for decades, making sure we never forgot the man my father was." "My grandfather never mentioned staying in touch with your family," Sarah said, confused. The Commander General smiled sadly. "That's because he made my mother promise to keep it secret. He was concerned that his continued contact with us might somehow compromise the classified nature of their mission. So for over 60 years, Eduardo Martinez quietly sent letters, birthday cards, and updates about his life to my mother and later to me. He even sent photographs of you when you were born." Sarah felt overwhelmed by this revelation. Her grandfather had maintained a secret relationship with the family of his fallen commander for her entire life, and she had never known about it. "The last letter I received from him was just before he passed away," Commander General Hayes continued. "He told me that he was worried about dying before he could find a way to honor the memory of Phantom Battalion. He mentioned that he was considering sharing the story with you, but he wasn't sure if you would believe him or if it would put you in any danger." "Danger?" Sarah asked. "The technology that Phantom Battalion tested during that mission eventually became the foundation for some of our most classified defense systems," he explained. "Even today, revealing too much about what they accomplished could compromise national security. Your grandfather was aware of this, but he also felt a responsibility to ensure that his fallen comrades weren't completely forgotten." The Commander General reached into his jacket again and pulled out a thick envelope. "This contains copies of the official records of Phantom Battalion, along with detailed reports of their mission and the experimental equipment they carried. It also includes personal letters from your grandfather, photographs, and documentation that proves every story he told you was absolutely true." Sarah accepted the envelope with trembling hands. "Sir, why are you sharing this with me? Isn't this still classified?" "Officially, yes," he replied. "But I have the authority to declassify certain historical records when it serves a legitimate purpose. Your grandfather's dying wish was that the sacrifice of his unit be remembered, and I believe you have a right to know that the man who raised you was a genuine American hero." Sarah opened the envelope and found herself looking at official military documents, mission reports, and photographs that perfectly matched the details depicted in her tattoo. There were images of the experimental weapons, the advanced communication equipment, and even detailed sketches of the uniforms that had seemed so anachronistic to her fellow soldiers. "My grandfather really did serve in a unit that was decades ahead of its time," she said, her voice filled with wonder and vindication. "He did more than serve," Commander General Hayes corrected her. "He helped change the course of history. The intelligence that Phantom Battalion gathered during that mission prevented the Germans from deploying radar technology that could have made their defense systems nearly impenetrable. The sacrifice of my father and the other men who died on that mission saved countless Allied lives." Sarah looked up from the documents, her mind reeling with the implications of what she was learning. "Sir, what does this mean for me? Can I tell people the truth now?" The Commander General considered her question carefully. "I'm going to make an exception in your case, but it comes with conditions. You can share the basic facts about your grandfather's service and the legitimacy of your tattoo, but you cannot reveal specific details about the technology they tested or the exact nature of their mission. Those aspects must remain classified." "I understand, sir. More importantly, I want you to know that your grandfather's legacy extends beyond just that single mission," he continued. "The letter he sent me before he died included a recommendation that you be considered for advanced military intelligence training. He believed you had inherited his sense of duty and his ability to keep important secrets." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "Sir, are you offering me a position in military intelligence?" "I'm offering you the opportunity to follow in your grandfather's footsteps," he replied. "If you're interested and if you can pass the necessary security clearances, there's a place for you in a unit that continues the work that Phantom Battalion started over 70 years ago." The weight of this offer was staggering. Sarah realized that her decision to honor her grandfather's memory with the tattoo had led to an opportunity she could never have imagined. "What would you need from me?" she asked. "First, absolute discretion about everything we've discussed today. Second, a commitment to excellence that matches what your grandfather demonstrated during his service. And third, the understanding that the work you'd be doing would be just as important and just as classified as what Phantom Battalion accomplished during the war." Sarah thought about the months of ridicule and doubt she had endured because of her insistence on telling the truth about her grandfather's service. She thought about the promise she had made to keep his memory alive and the incredible revelation that his stories were not only true, but had connected her to the son of his commanding officer. "Sir, I accept," she said firmly. Commander General Hayes smiled for the first time since their conversation had begun. "I thought you might. Your grandfather would be proud to know that his granddaughter is carrying on the family tradition of service to country above all else." As they prepared to leave the conference room, Sarah had one more question. "Sir, what should I tell my unit about what happened here today?" "Tell them that your grandfather's service has been verified by official sources, and that anyone who questions your integrity or your family's military record will answer to me personally," he replied. "I think you'll find that your fellow soldiers will treat you with considerably more respect from now on." When Sarah returned to her unit later that afternoon, word had already spread about her private meeting with Commander General Hayes. The soldiers who had spent months mocking her stories now approached her with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. Sergeant Williams was the first to speak up. "Martinez, I owe you an apology. I don't know what you and the Commander General discussed, but it's clear that there was more to your grandfather's story than any of us realized." Sarah looked around at the faces of her fellow soldiers. the same people who had dismissed her as a fantasist and attention seeker. "My grandfather served his country with honor and distinction," she said simply. "The details of his service may be classified, but his sacrifice and the sacrifice of his unit were very real." From that day forward, Sarah's reputation in the military was transformed. Her tattoo, once seen as evidence of her inability to distinguish between reality and fantasy, became a symbol of her family's legacy of service and her own commitment to carrying on that tradition. 6 months later, Sarah completed her transfer to a classified intelligence unit where her skills and her discretion were put to use in ways that would have made her grandfather proud. She never revealed the specific details of her new assignment, but those who knew her could see that she had found her true calling in service to her country. The tattoo on her arm remained as detailed and mysterious as ever, but now it represented something more than just her grandfather's stories. It represented the connection between past and present, the unbroken chain of service that linked her to generations of soldiers who had made sacrifices that the world would never fully understand or acknowledge. And sometimes, late at night when she was working on classified assignments that she could never discuss with anyone, Sarah would look at her tattoo and remember her grandfather's words about honoring those who never came home. She understood now that some stories are too important to remain untold, even if they must be hidden in symbols and images that only a few people will ever truly understand. The truth behind her tattoo had finally been confirmed, but more importantly, she had discovered her own truth in the process. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, carrying forward a legacy of service that began with 12 brave men who officially never existed, but whose impact on history would be felt for generations to come.